Chaos Galaxy is the second title released by Chaos Galaxy Studios, a single indie developer. This game expounds on every aspect of the previous game and adds 14 new factions, but it is not a sequel, as this game retcons the events of Chaos Sector. Anyway, let's jump right in with gameplay. Gameplay is broken up into a strategic layer and a tactical layer. We'll begin with the strategic layer. There are 14 playable factions in this game, and 3 unplayable factions. All of the factions in the game are broken up into 6 races. You have Imperials, Pirates, Merchants, Mercenaries, the Dune factions, which are kind of assassins, and finally the Omek, which are your highly advanced, technologically advanced faction. Every faction has its own research tree, though those of the same race often have similar trees. For example, Imperials favour beam weapons, so all of the Imperial factions' research trees favour beam weapons and revolve around increasing their stats. There are 3 resources in the game: Prestige, which influences when wandering officers join your faction, and whether officers you capture after destroying a faction will join you. Also helps with diplomacy. Countries are more likely to make agreements with countries with high prestige, obviously. Gold, which is spent on tech, ships, development and forts. Supplies, which is spent on ships and the upkeep of ships. All of these resources are pretty self-explanatory, but supplies are essentially supposed to be your military supplies. The main cost for producing ships is in supplies, and that they have a constant upkeep of supplies. So in a way, supplies are more important than gold, because gold is needed to build things and to, of course, produce the initial ships, but in order to keep those ships running, you need supplies. I do think it's a neat idea, the dividing gold into essentially 2 resources, one for development and one for military, essentially. In this game, there are actually 2 different kinds of units. We have ships, as I mentioned, and then we have mechs. Mechs are basically your space infantry. Mechanized units are a lot weaker than ships, and as they take damage, the effectiveness of the infantry decreases as they lose people in their unit. Basically, infantry units, mechs will have... when they attack, they'll do damage 3 times by default. And as they take damage, they lose members, which means they do the damage less times. For example, let's say you have a full power mechanized unit, it would attack 3 times when it attacks. Then when it takes a loss, it will go down to attacking 2 times. And then when it's on its final member, it'll go down to only attacking once. Meaning, unlike ships, in mechanized units, they become less effective as they take damage, whereas ships are as effective as they are at the start when they have max health, or even if they're on 1 health, they have the same level of damage and the same amount of attacks they do. When it comes to capturing planets, there are 2 ways to capture them, either by bombardment or assault. Bombardment is based on the amount of ships in the fleet above the planet. But the problem with bombardment is it actually damages the stats of the planet, which then have to be rebuilt, which reduces the planet's worth, obviously. Assault, on the other hand, doesn't damage the planet, but the effectiveness of it is based on the amount of mechs in your army. So building pure mech armies specifically to capture planets is viable, and it's a good way to avoid destroying the planet when you conquer it. Every fleet in the game is led by an officer. Officers have their own passive abilities as well as active abilities they can actually use in battles, as well as their own stats, that being the military stat and the administrative stat. The military stat directly correlates to the amount of ships or mechs they can have in their fleet, whereas the administrative stat affects the rate at which they'll increase the development of a planet if they're assigned as the governor of it. Officers are essentially immortal. If their fleets are defeated, they will just return to the map without any of their ships a few turns later. The only way to fully kill an officer is to defeat their faction and then choose to execute them, which may be something you want to do if a particular officer is unwilling to join you and is very good, and so you don't want other factions to recruit them and use them against you. One final thing I'll mention about the strategic layer is at the end of every year there is an annual strategy session where you're given quests. This is very similar to the early Total Wars where you were given randomly generated quests from members of your nation, like to the merchant class or the nobility. Now let's move on to the tactical layer. First of all, I'll say there's 119 different units spread across the 17 factions. Each unit has 3 stats: hull, energy, and morale. Hull, as I'm sure you would be able to guess, is the health of a unit. Energy is a little different though. Everything you do in the game requires energy. So if a unit attacks, the attack costs energy. If they use a defensive ability, that costs energy. And when their energy drops too low to use an attack, they basically can't fight back. They can't defend themselves, they can't attack the enemy. They're basically a walking target. Energy does replenish every turn in battle, but at a very slow rate. That increases the value of the supply ship, which can be used to resupply ships in battle with its own vast supplies. Finally, morale. When a unit is attacked from the sides and the back, its morale will decrease. If the morale hits 0, the unit will flee the battle, essentially. This actually makes it so weaker units like mechs can be used in a sort of swarm tactic where they attack ships from behind and from the sides. Even though they're not very strong and won't do much damage, they will decrease the morale and cause it to rout after a few attacks. Which is a nice idea. I think it does increase the value of weaker units that maybe can't defeat other more powerful ships in a straight up fight, but can defeat them by swarm tactics, as I said. Although routed units will survive and will return with the fleet if it retreats, or if the fleet that's routed units wins, the routed unit will still be there in its roster after the battle. As I mentioned, commanders have both passive skills and active skills. The active skills can be activated in battle after a certain amount of turns have passed, but the bar that essentially affects when you can use an ability will also go up if they take casualties, as that being meaning the commander who takes the most casualties will be able to use his active ability the soonest, and some of these abilities are very powerful. For example, there's one commander who has the ability to essentially disable all of the units within a small area for a few turns, or another commander who can directly take control of any enemy units that are next to his units for a single turn. In battles, there are also 2 forms of terrain. We have asteroids, which ships cannot move through, but mechs can, kind of making choke points in the battle and making it easy for mechs to ambush ships as they go through tight choke points within the terrain. Second, we have planets. When you end a turn on a planet, a ship on it will replenish both its health and its energy, making planets quite valuable as resupplying and regenerative points. That's one of the benefits defenders get in battle, as they can base their fighting around the planet, essentially, which allows them to regenerate their health and energy. Now let's talk about the positives. To start with, I really enjoyed the gameplay of this game. I really enjoyed making fleets and playing as all the different factions with their different rosters and making different units to fit each faction's strengths. For example, the assassins, who have very strong infantry, which can one-shot sometimes enemy units, or the mercenaries, whose ships had rams on the front of them, which meant they had the only ships in the game that could actually engage in melee. I really felt like the factions were diverse enough in their playstyles that I didn't have a problem playing every single one of them and completing the game with them. And while there's no real story development outside of a few events, I really like the narrative and setting. I actually really enjoyed the universe and the world building that is present. The setting, the factions, and the flavor text all did a lot to pull me in, even if the plot itself is pretty light. There's not really much story events outside of one, but what is there, I'd say it is good and I enjoyed it. Now for the negatives, I do think this game has a tendency to drag on in late game, like a lot of these sort of turn-based strategy games tend to, due to the large amount of troops, large amount of fleets, and the large amount of planets you need to conquer in order to actually win the game. I'll also say diplomacy is pretty easy to exploit. You can, even no matter which faction you're playing as, you can essentially befriend everyone in the galaxy and then pick them off one by one by using diplomacy to just increase their relationship with you to the point where they won't even try to attack you. Managing planets also becomes quite tedious, as does controlling your large fleets in the late game. After the initial early game, I often stopped bothering managing my planets and just left them to automatically grow on their own without assigning officers to manage them, just because it felt so tedious to do that. Also with fleets, I often found myself just ignoring my smaller and weaker officers and just having my more powerful officers, lead large fleets and fight battles while my weaker officers just sat around inside my space doing nothing, because I felt like it wasn't worth giving them their own armies and sending them out there. As I said, there isn't much of a structured story here outside of a few faction-specific events and, of course, each faction's ending. There's very little narrative development throughout the campaign. If you're someone who needs a strong story to stay engaged, this might be a downside. I will say, though, the events that are here are pretty good. For example, there is a major event where the Empire will break up into 2 factions in a large-scale civil war. Unfortunately, that's basically the only event like that. I really wish there were more events that had a big impact on the setting. Unfortunately, a lot of the events you probably will only see if you play as that faction and get their event. For example, if the pirates, either of the factions, capture the Imperial capital, they have the option to reduce it to a wasteland, or to take it as their own capital and found a new shogunate, which allows them to change their name. So those sort of events are great, but there just doesn't feel like enough of them, and the ones that are there you won't see most of the time. The only real event you'll see every time is the Empire breaking up, because it's kind of predetermined. Now for my final thoughts. This game is only about £12 or $15, and for the 92 hours of entertainment I got for it, I would say it's well worth the price. Keep in mind, of course, that I did 100% the game, played through as all factions, saw all their endings, got all the achievements. Unfortunately, this game is a Steam or Epic only tile, so if you want it elsewhere, you're out of luck. It also regularly goes on sale, both on Steam and on Epic, down to around £5 or $5, so if you're interested, maybe wait for a sale. I really enjoyed this game, but I will say if you're not a big fan of this style of turn-based strategy, I could see it being very tedious and boring for someone else. The same characters carried a lot of the weight for me. Without them, I'm not sure I would have enjoyed it nearly as much. As I said, I recommend it, but only for people who are really interested in the genre. Thank you for watching. I know this isn't a big game, but I loved it, so I had to talk about it. My next video is on a game I like to call Russian Homeworld. Feel free to guess what it is in the comments. See you next time.